Welcome to Think Energy, a podcast that dives into the fast-changing world of energy through conversations with industry leaders, innovators, and people on the front lines of the energy transition. Join me, Trevor Freeman, as I explore the traditional, unconventional, and up-and-coming facets of the energy industry. If you have any thoughts, feedback, or ideas for topics we should cover, please reach out to us at thinkenergy@hydroottawa.com. Hey everyone, and welcome back. Well, we find ourselves here at the tail end of 2024, about to wrap up the year. Hopefully, you are all looking at some restful holiday plans, a chance to sort of unwind and decompress after what seems to be the same every year, kind of a busy year. There's always lots going on, but hopefully, you're looking forward to some downtime over the holidays. I know I certainly am. As is normal at the end of the year, we are looking back on the year that was, the year that we've just gone through. And I'll say right off the bat that I'm really grateful for this year and this chance to step into the host role of the Think Energy podcast. Earlier this year, I took over in March of this year when the previous host, Dan Seguin, retired. So I'll express my gratitude right off the bat to Dan and team for sort of pioneering this podcast over the previous years and then trusting me to take over the host chair. It's been a really fun journey and fun to kind of engage with our guests on different topics that I'm really passionate about. You guys know from listening to this that I really like talking about climate change and energy and the energy transition. And this is a really cool and neat platform to be able to do that. So thanks to the team for trusting me with that role. One thing we've been doing as we've been looking back is trying to figure out, what is the main theme of this podcast here? What do we actually talk about? In our last episode, that we did a bit of a summary of some of the top episodes from the year in terms of, interest from you, the listener. For this one, what we wanted to do is really embody the theme of the year. And I think it should be no surprise that the theme is the energy transition. I mean, that's kind of the theme of the podcast. I know we touch on other aspects of working in the energy sector, but the energy transition is really the all-encompassing theme or thing that we talk about and we spend a lot of time on here in this podcast. And so we wanted to bring you some of the episodes that really talk through what that energy transition is and what does it mean for us? What does it mean for us as energy consumers, as homeowners and people that work and own and run businesses, as people that work in the utility industry and are making decisions about the future of energy. So we've picked a few clips from the year that we think really embody that. So get comfy. Hopefully you're warm inside as it's maybe snowy out where you are. Maybe not. Maybe you're listening from somewhere warm, but get comfy and have a listen to what we think are some of the clips that really embody what this year was about when it comes to the energy transition. To start things off, I think it would be good and unfortunately, you're going to have to listen to my voice for another little bit longer. It'll be good to start with an episode I did not too long ago, which was really a primer on the energy transition, which really focused on helping everybody wrap their heads around what exactly is this thing that we talk about called the energy transition. So have a listen to this clip from that. And if you're interested, go back and listen to the whole episode. When we think about the energy transition, we probably mostly think of this ongoing shift to cleaner, emissions-free energy. So EVs over gas cars, heat pumps over gas furnaces, etc. That is definitely part of it. In fact, that's a major part of it. But like most things in life, it's never just as simple as that. The energy transition is a truly fundamental shift in our global relationship with energy, which includes not just what makes our cars go, but everything from how, where, and when we generate energy, how, where, and when we store and use energy, how we pay for the energy we use, how we finance and pay for energy projects and the systems that we need to do all the things I just mentioned. It will include a shift in what policies and regulatory guidelines and barriers we put in place to protect the public, but that also encourage change that we want to see happen to allow for innovation and advancement. It isn't completely throwing out everything we have and starting from scratch. although some things will disappear, like coal-fired electricity generation, for example. But in a lot of areas, it is building on what we've already got at a pace that we haven't seen before, or at least in a very long time. And I think that's a key point here. One of the things that makes the energy transition a change worth noting is the pace of change that we will see. Things have never really been static in the world of energy. From that time when our earliest ancestors first sparked that fire, this is the poetic part that I mentioned earlier, our relationship to energy has never really stood still. But other than a few significant events, the upward trend in sophistication and growth and scope has been fairly linear, gradual, one step after the other, et cetera. It's those exceptions, though, those things that are different from that gradual linear growth that probably most closely resemble this period of change that has started that we're calling the energy transition. Take the Industrial Revolution, for example. For decades and centuries prior, there had been gradual improvements in how we got around or how we worked the fields, let's say, first by hand, then with tools. Maybe a better plow came along, and we started using a horse or an oxen to pull that plow, etc. Then along comes the steam engine, and all of a sudden, things take off like never before. It wasn't just a matter of swapping out a horse for an engine. It may have started there, but entire economies and aspects of society changed or sprang up where they didn't exist before. One change rolls into another and another in quick succession, and before too long, things that couldn't be imagined only decades before are suddenly a reality. To a degree, that's what we're looking at today with the energy transition. How far that change goes remains to be seen, but it's pretty clear that we have begun one of those disruptive periods of change that will be looked back on as a major turning point. So, yes, the energy transition is about shifting away from greenhouse gas emitting fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, etc., to renewable, non emitting energy sources, solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, etc. But it's also so much more. Even without climate change, our need for energy is growing at an exponential pace. In Canada, we're fortunate in that we have a strong foundation with a relatively decarbonized grid already, so about 80% carbon free nationally, and a diverse mix of hydro, nuclear, and renewables like wind and solar. But it's still going to take quite a lot of effort to decarbonize that remaining 20% at a time when, as I keep mentioning, demand is increasing rapidly. In Ontario, our electricity system operator, the IESO, just updated their future demand projections to show that provincial demand will be 75% more or less higher by 2050 than it is today. This means we also need to invest in our grid infrastructure to ensure it can handle the increased load, as well as utilizing things like decentralized generation and storage to ensure we don't overbuild, not to mention making sure we can handle more extreme weather.
So I think that's a good place to set the stage for us. But now let's get into some of the real experts on this. And we'll go next to a conversation that I had with Francis Bradley, who's the president and CEO of Electricity Canada. Electricity Canada is the sort of national voice of sustainable electricity here in Canada. They represent 40 of the largest utility companies. So that's companies that generate, transmit, and distribute electricity from coast to coast all across Canada. And Francis and I talked about what level of investment is going to be required in order to accomplish some of those aspects of the energy transition that we talk about. So here's what Francis had to say about that.
I mean, these these are great questions in terms of what the investments are going to look like. And so, we're looking at as I said earlier, doubling the grid. We're going to need at least two times more kilowatt hours when we get to the future. So, that's the level of investment that we need to be thinking about. There have been different organizations that have tried to kind of get a scope and scale. Of what that actually looks like. Again, I mentioned the RBC Climate Institute. Last year, it had a study that came out, and I believe they pegged this at I think it was $2 trillion was the amount that they expected this to cost. Where's the money coming from? Well, that's a really good question. And it's one that we've been engaging in for a number of years now. And I'll try not to be like totally pedantic on this, but if you if you consider from a public policy standpoint, if we believe that expanding the electricity system is necessary to decarbonize the Canadian economy, then essentially what you're saying is that expanding the electricity system is a public good.
Mhm.
From an economic theory standpoint, if it's a public good, well, then it is something that should be borne by that taxpayer, not the ratepayer, right? And so, part of this discussion is who needs to bear the costs for building out a clean, non-emitting electricity system so that the rest of the economy can decarbonize. Should it be the electricity customer, or are there parts of this core infrastructure that are regarded as a public good, and it's something that is paid for by the taxpayer? And we see this in other sectors as well, where certain things are perceived to be public good, and they're taxpayer supported. And we saw a bit of a recognition and a realization that this made sense to a degree in the federal government's budget in 2023, where they essentially pledged one in every $8 in new spending was going to go to clean electricity projects through a variety of means. The investment tax credits, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, a number of funding mechanisms. So, that those kinds of dollars from the federal government was a commitment to building infrastructure that really is unheard of at a national level since the Second World War. So, it really kind of moved clean energy and electrification into the category of, well, I guess it's a public good, because there's a recognition that if the federal government wants to achieve these policy objectives, it needs to put some federal dollars in. So, that determination is, and whether it's a public good or not, has been made in favor of the taxpayer versus the ratepayer. Now, again, you could easily say, well, hang on a second, the ratepayer and the taxpayer are the same person, except that it doesn't quite work the same way. Do we want to attach to the customer's bills, every single customer, the cost of this expansion of our infrastructure, or not? And electricity bills are not something that fall as taxes do disproportionately on those that are more wealthy, right? And so it is a little more fair. Now, in terms of the specific investments, I think exactly how this is going to happen and how it's going to roll out, those details are still being worked out by some of our members. But I do want to highlight that the approach here that we're seeing from the government, which we appreciate, is one that is so far technology and agnostic, which we think is the right way to go. So there isn't a right way or a wrong way to generate electricity. So the future that we see is going to be an all of the above future that will encompass wind and solar and nuclear and traditional hydro and hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. And more. Not only does that give us, the greatest flexibility and gives us the ability to balance different types of generation, dispatchable versus non-dispatchable, but it also gives us, overall a far more flexible system. So, that's what the future is going to look like. So to give you the short answer, it'll be all of the above, and it'll be probably $2 trillion. I kind of touched on this a couple of times, but first and foremost, the energy transition, if you will, as I noted earlier, can't be paid exclusively by the ratepayers, right? This is an overall objective that we have, and so the infrastructure build is so large that it needs to be. Certainly, parts of it need to be paid through the tax system, and that is progressive in a way that rates are not progressive to begin with. Now, but boy, addressing vulnerable customers, absolutely critical. There's a variety of things that could be tried. In the United States, there's a low income home energy assistance program that it helps keep families safe and healthy through initiatives that assist families with energy costs. This, I think they call it the LIHEAP, provides federally funded assistance to reduce the costs associated with home energy bills, energy crises, weatherization, and minor energy related home repairs. So, A similar initiative in Canada could be there to assist the most vulnerable. As you're aware, your most vulnerable customers are the ones that have the least capacity to do things like weatherization. And so, there's an example of a national program that we could look at as a model.
Francis is spot on there when he talks about not only the energy transition's potential impact on our most vulnerable, so those living in energy poverty areas or struggling with energy affordability, but also everybody who's looking to make improvements to their homes where they live in order to reduce costs and participate in the energy transition. That brings us to my next clip that I'd like to share with you, and that's a conversation I had with Sarah Grant. Sarah Grant's a good friend of mine who also happens to be an expert in her field, which is helping everyday Canadians on their journey to decarbonizing their homes so that they can contribute to Canada's energy transition. Looking at what are the things you do in a home to decarbonize? How do you go about that process? Sarah and her company Goldfinch Energy are based out of Toronto, and it was really great to hear what she had to say about what it takes to decarbonize a home.
Okay, going from large to small. So the largest source of emissions in a home is your space heating. Typically, the emissions are about the same as driving a sort of a mid to large sized car. Most people drive on average 15,000 kilometers a year. The emissions are going to be about the same. So that's going to be the biggest one if someone is looking and they're a little bit overwhelmed. And the best alternative is a heat pump. So these are, they come in many different forms, but the most common, and I think the most common scenario for most homes is if you have forced air, so ductwork. And these kind of heat pumps can extract heat from the air outside. A lot of them can work up to minus 30 degrees. So even up to minus 30, they're able to grab latent heat in the air and pump it inside. And then it gets pumped around your house. The cool thing about them is that they can also work in reverse. So in the summer, they act just like an air conditioner. In fact, the technology is very much the same as an air conditioner, just that they work in reverse in the winter too. So they can also cool. So these are called air source heat pumps. And yeah, if someone has forced air and they have a gas furnace or an air conditioner or both that need to be replaced, an air source heat pump is a great option. A lot of the folks that we've worked with that have switched, you talked about comfort, sort of some of the side benefits, I would say, of a heat pump is they're typically quieter. If designed and sized and installed properly, they're quieter, both the outside and the inside aspects of a heat pump. And the air from the vents is a lot more comfortable. So we got a heat pump about 3 years ago, and the first winter we had it installed, my father-in-law came over for dinner one night and just stood in front of the vent, kind of like a cat, basking in that warmth, and said, "Oh my gosh, this is way more comfortable." It's not that dry, scorched air that a lot of people associate with forced air. So that's an air source heat pump. There are also ground source heat pumps, but for a lot of urban areas, these ground source heat pumps involve drilling into the ground, either horizontally or vertically, to extract heat from the ground. I have worked with a few homes in sort of more rural areas where it does make sense, but the costs associated with them are really high, and often there's not enough space in urban areas. So they're not quite as common. And I'd say, sort of just to kind of close the conversation we'll sort of conclude it on the heating side of things. If you do have another source of like heat, maybe it's cast iron radiators or baseboards, there are also heat pumps that can help you as well. So with cast iron radiators, they're what's called air to water heat pumps. So the outdoor unit will look similar to someone who has forced air. So it's going to extract heat from the outside air, and it'll transfer it to water now that can then go through your cast iron radiators, or maybe have in-floor heating or what have you. They're not as common, but the technology has existed for a long time in Europe, and there are more products and contractors that I'm working with that are becoming more comfortable with installing this technology. And last, there are what's called ductless heat pumps. So if you don't have ductwork or cast iron radiators, or maybe have baseboards, or maybe there's a space where the ductwork just isn't sufficient, these ductless heat pumps can be installed. They can either go on the wall on sort of these big white boxes. If you've been to Asia, you're probably familiar with them because they exist there either in the form of heat pumps or air conditioners. Or you can have little floor mounted ones as well, which look a little bit more slick, I suppose, but they do cost a little bit more. So that's heating. For hot water, there are kind of two main options. If you want to get off of fossil fuels, usually that's, for most of us, that's with the gas, but there could be propane as well. So if you want to get off of fossil fuels with your hot water, the heat pump technology exists with hot water as well. Heat pump hot water tanks is what they're called, or actually confusingly sometimes hybrid tanks, because they use heat pump technology, but then also have an electric coil. So they can operate like a simple electric tank if needed. And they come with a little like Wi-Fi app too. So they are like 4 times more efficient than a gas hot water tank. So you will save a little bit by switching to them, but the way they work is they'll extract heat from your basement, actually. So from your basement air, and transfer that to the water. So I would say about half the people I work with end up going with them because they have a space where it makes sense. Maybe their basement is large and they can put it kind of in the corner in a big mechanical room or a workshop where they're not going to go into it. So if that heat pump reduces the temperature by 2 degrees or so, it's not a big deal. But for me, my home is pretty tiny and we're using every nook and cranny with 5 of us in it. So we opted for an electric tank and then paired it with a timer so that it only reheats the water overnight when electricity, if you're on time of use, is cheapest. And that's also when our Ontario grid is using the non-fossil fuel related forms of power production like nuclear and water. So that can work if you're really lucky and you have an unfinished basement and a good space to install what's called a drain water heat recovery system. These are super cool, very simple technologies that can transfer the heat from any water that you've already used, like from your shower, and transfer it to the fresh water before that fresh water then goes into whatever heating mechanism you have. So they can work with anything. Even if you have a gas hot water tank, a drain water heat recovery system is a good way to kind of preheat the water by extracting the heat from the hot water you've already used. A lot of hospitals I know in Toronto are starting to use these kind of systems as well. So 2 main options: electric tank, heat pump hot water tank, and then those drain water heat recovery systems as well. And hot water, so, I said you're heating your house. It's usually about kind of 80 or so % of a home emissions. Hot water is around 15 to 20%, just to give an idea of sort of how it fits into the relative picture. But ultimately, I wouldn't say, do one over the other unless, if you have a hot water tank that's broken, replace that with an electric tank or heat pump hot water tank. Don't just say, oh, it's only 20%, I shouldn't do that one. It's still worth it. Every little appliance that you can get off of fossil fuels is one step closer to then being able to disconnect from the gas utility or what have you, and sets you up for ultimately like a little bit of savings too, because you're no longer paying for that delivery fee to have access to that fossil fuel in your house. So cooking is probably, to be honest, like the most fun of all of these, just because, it impacts your daily life. If like hot water and heating and cooling are one of those things where I don't think about my heat pump unless it's not working properly, which we haven't had an issue with, but it just sits there and it does its thing. And I'm happy to have it off of fossil fuels. But for cooking, we switched from a gas stove to an induction stove about a year ago. And it's amazing. Like, I've got little kids and I love that I feel comfortable teaching them how to cook on this stove just because of the way the induction stove works. The whole cooktop doesn't get heated up in the same way. If you accidentally leave like a rag or a paper towel on the stove, it's not going to catch on fire. We did have a few of those incidences with our former gas stove, and it's really quick. I know that there's a lot of stats and data about how quick it can heat up water, but it's one of those things that you don't believe it until you sort of experience it yourself. So, so we got a nice slick induction stove, because our gas stove was kind of reaching its end of life and we were starting to smell some of the gas as well, even when it wasn't on, which I know is an issue. That's something that's hazardous for our health. And there's a lot of research and evidence out there related to like respiratory issues and gas related cooking. So if you do have a gas stove and you aren't able to afford to switch now, make sure you're using your exhaust, like your range hood, properly, not just when you're using the top, but when you're cooking in the oven too. But yeah, if you're able to switch it out, then you can just breathe a little easier knowing that you're not using some sort of like fossil fuel to cook with, and so your house is cleaner and you're making the planet a bit cleaner as well.
So with that clip, we can all kind of plan out our projects for 2025 and beyond if we haven't already. Great to hear that from Sarah again. Those are some real tangible actions that we can take or we can plan to take in the near future. So the conversation that you just heard with Sarah is really focused around homeowners, but in the context of a kind of an urban setting. You've got access to contractors, you've got access to expertise, you've got access to supply chains, but there are a whole host of people, our neighbors and our fellow country people living in remote communities that are just not connected to a national grid or a provincial grid or even to a natural gas grid in some cases. I had a really great chat with Gemma Pynchon from Quest Canada, who is leading some research on how rural and remote communities, including many Indigenous areas, can engage in the energy transition equitably and sustainably. And we talked about some of the challenges that those areas and communities face. So have a listen to this chat with Gemma Pynchon.
Through Quest's projects, particularly the Net Zero Community Accelerator, which works with communities the end goal is to create community energy and emissions plan. We saw, and also through policy work and those kinds of pieces, we saw that there was the net zero transition is sort of chugging along, but there's kind of been a gap. The transition tends to focus more on the urban context, urban population centers, the big cities, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, those kinds of places. And that we saw as leaving out a really big chunk of Canadians. I think the statistic off the top of my head is 1/5 of Canadians live in rural and remote places. So it's not a small statistic. So we wanted to make sure that as the net zero transition was moving along and progressing, that this large group of Canadians weren't forgotten about. And the net zero transition is going to rely, and has been relying on rural land, rural populations, to house renewable energy for food production as well as carbon sequestration. So leaving this big group of people out is just kind of inconceivable, I guess. And what Quest saw was that this was happening. So we started this research project to sort of make sure that those voices were being heard and considered as Canada moves through the net zero transition. So I think there's this idea that a one-size-fits-all solution for every community, and that solutions that work in urban centers will work in rural centers. And that's just not the case. For example, something obvious like transportation, my literature review highlighted that within urban centers, the most sustainable option would obviously be public transport. But if you apply that same lens to a rural community, cars are bad and we shouldn't be using them. Rural communities, it's almost impossible to be sustainable in net zero because they don't have the public transport option. So in that context, looking at it with a different lens, looking at it with a rural lens, you would look at sort of like consolidating car trips or making sure that services like healthcare and groceries and, the things that we take for granted in urban centers, making sure those are close, like they're kept in communities. Like a lot of services are kind of moving out of rural communities, and that doesn't necessarily seem like a net zero issue. But when people in those communities have to drive like 3 times as long to get to their doctor, that's a huge, emissions issue, and it was an interesting look at the way that even myself, before I was doing this, I was like, well, cars are bad. Like, like gas cars aren't great for emissions. But the reality is for rural communities, they need this transportation, that there's no other way for them to get around, and it would be incredibly isolating, and you can't function as a society if you're just stuck in your house. So having that different lens and looking at it in a different context, I think that's really, really important as we move rural communities through this net zero transition. Well, in those communities that aren't connected to, natural gas or the electricity grid, like diesel used to be their only option. Modern life, we need electricity power. Like we need to power modern life. You can't have a modern existence without some form of power. So, diesel, they're completely reliant on diesel, the ones that aren't connected. I mean, it's frustrating because these communities do tend to be quite far away from the power grid infrastructure. So it's usually considered economically non-viable to connect those remote communities to the provincial power grids, because these communities are also very small. So it's a small number of people that you would have to spend all this money for the infrastructure to get, the power lines to them. And Ontario, Canada, both of them are very big. So there's many communities that exist quite far away from power lines or existing grid infrastructure. So diesel it's kind of been their only option for power to have a modern existence up until, I would say now, well, recently. So I think in terms of, for rural, remote and Indigenous communities, I definitely think we need more research like what I'm doing. I think these are voices that haven't necessarily been heard. And if we're going to have an energy transition, we need to include these voices. And I think the best way to do that is to sort of do research like mine and figure out what their needs are and how we can progress to that next step. There's some amazing thinking, specifically of like Indigenous organizations that are already doing great work in this space, like Indigenous Clean Energy and the Center for Indigenous Environmental Research. So they're already doing this, but just consolidating all of that and having people, governments actually listen, I think is really, really important. I think, those voices just need to be heard and listened to. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere. It'll be, like you said, like we're just putting in technology and then just kind of like leaving it there. And that's not going to work. We're not going to get anywhere with that sort of approach. So making sure local context is understood and local voices are heard.
And finally, to wrap up this episode, I wanted to share a clip of a conversation that I had with two really brilliant folks from EY Global, Greg Guthridge and Nicholas Hancock. I talked to Greg and Nicholas about the fact that in the end, we are all end users of energy. It doesn't matter what your role is in the energy transition. It doesn't matter where you live, where you work. We're all consumers of energy, and we all need to live in homes that have heat and cooling in some places of the world. We work in buildings that are like that. We need to get around and charge our devices and cook. And so we all have a stake in this. We all have a role in this. And my conversation with Greg and Nicholas really talked about their work in helping industry and businesses navigate this energy transition and inspire and influence action amongst all kinds of consumers, because not everybody approaches the energy transition in the same way. And it was really great to chat with Nicholas and Greg about how they see the approach to the energy transition with consumers.
Yeah, Trevor, I'm glad you brought up the word customer, because we use that word as kind of an overarching term. And let me, if you don't mind, I'll dive in a little bit more on that, because Customer is actually, I'll use it on occasion, but it's actually a bit of an old-fashioned term, believe it or not. We try to use the term consumer, or even better, omnisumer, when we talk about the participants in the energy experience moving forward. And we're picking these words carefully because customer kind of implies a one-way interaction. Consumer implies that you're dealing with a customer or a participant that's two-way, that's engaging, in a much more active capacity. And then you get into omnisumer, which is what we believe really the consumer of the future. These are participants that are, multi-channel, multi-product, multi-provider, a many to many kind of experience. So you'll hear me use them all interchangeably, but really what we're trying to convey is that, the good old days of somebody at the end of the value chain just receiving a bill for energy that they take for granted is disappearing. Now, to your actual question, around the different strata of consumers, we do think of it in terms of there's residential customers, the mass market, the people at home. And then we have a number of other sort of major categories that we think about. There's small and medium businesses, large commercial and industrial. There's a category which we call MUSH, which is municipal and universities and schools and hospitals. And then there's a kind of new categories of consumers that are forming, peer-to-peer and prosumer type of consumers that are trading energy, or, they might have electric vehicles or solar or storage, and they're not just consuming electricity for their own benefit. They're actually selling it back into the grid or to others, and becoming more of a business partner along the way. So the takeaway here is that what used to be a passive one-way customer experience is now leaning into a much more two-way engaged and much more complex consumer experience between the energy provider and their participants. Trevor, I'm going to start the response to this, and then I'm going to hand it over to Nicholas Hancock, who leads our research, to give a bit more of some color commentary on how we structured our research. But to start off with, we really, about 4 or 5 years ago, we started to really think about the supply and demand of the energy transition, and a lot of focus around the world is on the supply side, building the infrastructure, building in new renewable and green and sustainable sources, getting all of the technology to get cleaner power from one place to another from an engineering perspective. And what we really started to realize is that, as a part of the energy transition, if you think about it, we're trying to do a generation of change in just a couple of decades. And on the demand side of this equation, we've got a bunch of very complex consumers that interact and behave irrationally with different behaviors. Some will be very excited about the energy transition, others will be very reticent, and everything in between. And so, in order for the energy transition to accelerate and to achieve the benefits that we're all looking for, we need to find a way to engage the consumer in ways which, frankly, are going to really push the envelope with consumers. So we started our research program, and Nicholas Hancock, who's on, has been leading the charge. And I think, Nick, if you don't mind, can you give us a quick overview on the global nature of the research and how we've approached it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we started our research program about 3 years ago, really trying to take a global view, mixing regions that are both, some of them really leading out there on the front edges of the energy transition. So we've got countries, for example, like Sweden, that are, kind of further down the path, as well as, North America, which is, I would say, a little bit more in the middle. And then we've got some countries that are maybe lagging or taking their own paths in the energy transition. We've included countries like China, Singapore. We included Indonesia last year. So really a global view of what are consumers kind of thinking in terms of how they approach the energy transition, what sort of products and services are they interested in, and what are the values and preferences that they bring to it when it comes to their energy providers, but also a broader ecosystem of providers that we see emerging out there. who are they really interested in turning to when it comes to advice, when it comes to learning about solutions, purchasing them, and even things like, for example, control over solutions in the home, which when it comes to energy flexibility in the future is really important. We've been exploring how do different consumers approach and feel about this. And so what we did is we developed a survey. We're entering our fourth year of doing that now. We work with a third party to do those surveys online across the globe. So it is sort of an independent third party that helps us to perform those. And then we take those results back and take a look at what we see. And to your point, Trevor, around sort of the voices of the transition, we've been looking at how do some of those different groups break out? What are the different values of different aspects of those consumers out there? Because even sitting around the dinner table, I'm sure everybody can feel we don't all have the same opinions when it comes to energy. And even more so when it starts to come to things like changes to your home or changes to your vehicles. So that's really what we've been exploring for the last number of years.
What we did is, having looked at all these different markets, we found some pretty interesting similarities. And the percentages of the population that fit into these five categories, it varies quite significantly, market by market, country by country, geography by geography. But there's a way for us to more simply think about a incredibly complex, fragmented, distributed customer base, residential mass market customer base, into what we think are really simply five different categories. And we the organization of these five categories, we've thought about them from a behavioral perspective, from a value, from a, what's their interests and how do they plan to engage. And it's sort of in sequence here. I'll talk about the five and I'll put them in the order of from most active to least active. I'll describe each of these. And the key thing here to keep in mind is that there's no wrong place to be as a residential customer. And you can actually flip around. You can move from one place to another almost overnight. So it's quite a fluid approach here. But the first category is what we call the energy champions. They're the savvy customers. They're actually the customers that have been the first to move, and the ones that we see in the news already. They're probably already using new energy products and services in their home. They might have solar on the roof. They could potentially have storage. They might already be using an electric vehicle. We make fun of this category a little bit. They're usually the ones that pre-order their iPhone. They might already have an interest in the new Tesla truck or some other device. They're absolutely the innovators. They're the early movers, and they're interested in spending time researching. They're going to pay attention to where their energy source is coming from, and they're going to be quite active. So those are the energy champions. The next category is what we call the energy enthusiasts. And this is actually the one that we have to pay the most attention to. They're the fast followers. They're the energy conscious category. And when they observe what the champions are doing and when they get a bit more comfortable and they start to move, they actually will influence the whole market. And as the enthusiasts, maybe slightly a little more cautious, but they're also, the fast followers. So once they can see the value proposition, once they're convinced that the technologies and capabilities are for real, then they're going to move. They may not pre-order their iPhone, but they're probably pretty close in terms of thinking about how they're going to advance into the energy market. The next category is the novice category or the agnostics. And what's interesting about this category is this segment of customers or consumers, they're actually pretty passive. They can see the value proposition. They can see that there's a lot of people taking interest in it, but for a number of different reasons, they're not moving. They're very novice. They're very agnostic, and it's because they're starting to think about other things. Like, well, all right, I can see that I can save money, or I can do something that will improve the environment, but it's just going to take too much time, or I have other priorities, or whatever. So, as an industry, we need to find a way to kind of activate and excite. We need to make it as effortless and frictionless as possible for this category of consumers to move. And they will move and they will do things, but they're just influenced by a whole lot of other variables you know that they believe are a higher priority. The fourth category is what we call the bystanders or the skeptics, and they are the ones that are a little bit they're not they're a bit mistrusting, frankly, of the messaging around the energy transition, around sustainability or environmental, and they're probably going to take a fairly skeptic approach to is this for real? Is it really going to provide me benefit? Is it really going to advance my personal capabilities? And so what's interesting about this group is they're actually very interested in new energy products and services, but for different reasons. So they're going to want more control. They're going to want maybe off-grid capabilities, and so they're actually as interested as the others, but the way you approach them is going to be very, very different. And the final category are the allies. And this is energy is a household necessity. And this category is very dependent. They might have, income challenges. They might have other challenges that we have to look after. It is a critical household service that we provide. And we need to make sure that we look after, the low income, the vulnerable, the medical dependencies that you find in the allies or the dependent category. So the range of consumers across these five will vary. We've got a great little quiz that you can take out there on ey.com, or you can go out and answer some questions, and it'll tell you which kind of consumer you are today. But it's yeah, we see that most consumers will fit into one of these five categories and then move from there, depending on what's happening in their life experiences.
Okay, well, there you have it. I hope that those clips give you a sense of some of the different aspects of the energy transition, what it is, and how it impacts all of us. I really encourage you, if you haven't already listened to those, to go back and have a listen to those and other episodes from this year. I think it's been a great year of great conversations, and what I hope comes through, not just the conversations you've heard today, but all the episodes that we have, is this idea that there is hope. And that may be kind of a funny thing to hear, but oftentimes when we're hearing about climate change and the energy transition and the challenges that we face, it can be discouraging. But there is some really great and interesting things happening, and some innovation that's happening. And as someone that works in this space, I think it's really important to be aware of the context that we work in, but also be optimistic and to focus on the really cool and great things that we're doing. And I think that echoes across most, if not all, of the guests that I've had on the show this year, really hearing their passion and their hope for what is to come. So have a listen, take some hope from that as you relax over the holidays as we round out this year. So as we round out this episode, I do want to give another thanks to all the guests that we've had on the show this year. We certainly couldn't do this without the fantastic and amazing people that we bring on to chat with. Goodness knows you don't want to just hear me ramble on episode after episode. So really appreciate people taking the time to come and share their thoughts and insights with us. I also want to say a huge thank you to the team that is behind pulling these episodes together. This is a multi-person contribution with folks across Hydro Ottawa and our partners that help us pull this together. And I want to especially call out Morgan Barnes for his help in really pulling the content and the feel and the texts together behind these episodes. It's me rambling here behind the microphone, but really Morgan and I work together to pull together what the theme and the thread of these episodes are. So big thanks to Morgan for his thought leadership in this, and his dedication and hard work in helping pull these things together. Morgan, you're the best. Okay, so with that, my team is always kind of after me to answer these rapid fire questions that you often hear at the end of episodes. But they also gave me an out because I don't tend to do that. So the out is, what is one of my favorite holiday traditions? So I'm gonna pivot and pull that one as we go into the holiday season here. And I think I was reflecting on this. I think one of my favorite holiday traditions, at least in the last little while, as I've kind of built a family and have a growing family, is going and getting that Christmas tree. And a number of years ago now, we moved houses, and it's not a big house. It's a house in Ottawa here, but we have this small part of the back of our house that has a really high ceiling. And so as we were out the first year, we always go to one of those cut your own tree farms and cut our tree down. And I had this idea that, oh, we've got a really high ceiling, so we've got to get a really tall tree. And that kind of started a bit of a precedent now where I can't go out and get just a little tree anymore. The kids want, well, I say the kids, it's probably more me, but the kids and I both want that tall tree that kind of scrapes the ceiling as we put it up. So that's always fun, trying to find that right tree, the perfect shape, to cut it down, to haul it back to the car, and try not to pull too many muscles doing it. So I'd say that's one of my favorite holiday traditions, and then to sit in the house and have that nice, fresh smelling Christmas tree for at least a few weeks. So that's my favorite holiday tradition. Thanks for joining us in 2024. We really appreciate you listening. We appreciate the conversations. As always, don't hesitate to reach out to us. thinkenergy@hydroottawa.com is our email address. We would love to hear from you, love to hear your ideas and thoughts on topics and guests. So there we are at the end of the year, and we look forward to connecting with you again in 2025, where we will be back with more episodes, more guests, more conversations about energy and the energy transition. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Think Energy podcast. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and it would be great if you could leave us a review. It really helps to spread the word. As always, we would love to hear from you, whether it's feedback, comments, or an idea for a show or a guest. You can always reach us at thinkenergy@hydroottawa.com.